Hello, it's Wednesday, the 7th of February, 2018 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators in higher education. I'm your host, Heather Shea, broadcasting live from Michigan State University at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Student Affairs Live, 2018 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Hold on, we're having some technical issues today. The online learning community for student affairs educators in higher education. Okay. I think I'm back. Sorry. We are having technical issues today, but we are doing the best we can. So thank you for hanging with us. So back to where I was saying is my introduction. On today's episode, I have the pleasure of talking with 6 panelists about opportunities for engagement in conversation about racial justice and decolonization at the upcoming ACPA Convention in Houston, Texas. So in a moment, I'll introduce the 6 folks who are joining me today. But before I do, I need to just give a quick shout out to those who make these free webcasts possible. So today's episode is made possible by ACPA, our exclusive sponsor. ACPA is one of the many ways that you can receive professional development. If you go to myacpa.org, you can find all kinds of other ways to engage. And if you have not yet registered for the 2018 ACPA Convention in Houston, registration rates go up this Friday. So we would love for you to register. Please visit the link that we are tweeting out right now. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Thanks again to my friend, Erica Thompson, for hanging with us on some technical issues today. And if you have questions, Erica is monitoring our back channel, and she will let me know. We're happy to incorporate those into today's discussion. We broadcast live on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and most of, or all of Tony's and my past episodes are free and easy to access in our archives. We are also produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. We have a new white paper in our myth-busting series that's available, and we're tweeting out a link to that right now. So now on with today's episode. On many campuses, administrators look to student affairs educators to facilitate conversations and work directly with students and other staff to discuss campus issues related to racial justice and decolonization. Regardless of whether our official job description tasks us with these functions, all of us are responsible for addressing campus climate issues. And certainly our role in supporting students in their activism and engagement is central to our work. So as we work to create alliances across communities and work collaboratively, as the title of today's episode suggests, there is so much work to do. Regardless of whether our graduate programs prepared us for these roles, we can gain skills and further our own awareness in order to effectively lead conversations related to racial justice and decolonization through professional development. So on today's episode, we have 6 leaders who are either involved with the 2018 convention team and or have been engaged with the ACPA strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. We're going to talk about the topic a little bit and contextualize what we mean by the work. And then we're going to turn to talking about the many opportunities for engagement at the ACPA convention next month in Houston. So as a side note, I know that in preparing for this episode, we received some really helpful feedback, and we realized it would be useful to host a future episode focused specifically on decolonization in higher education and student affairs. So I am in the process right now of identifying panelists and scheduling that episode for later this semester. Also, before I introduce our 6 panelists, lots of disclaimers today, sorry folks. But before I introduce our 6 panelists joining the conversation, please know that the voices here today don't collectively represent all of the individual identities that are engaged in this work. Tony and I aim to identify panelists of professionals and scholars who can speak to these issues regardless of positionality. And I'm deeply grateful to the ACPA leadership who were able to suggest individuals to participate in today's show. So let me introduce them. So joining me today are Dr. Dre Domingue. Hi, Dre. Bill Huff. Lynn Huynh. Hi, Lynn. Melissa Beard-Jacob. Ray Plaza, hi Ray, and Richie Stevens. Thank you all for being here. Hopefully everybody's connection is working. We're having technical issues all around, but as you all introduce yourselves, if you could share a little bit about what you do when you're not working on ACPA work, but then what your responsibilities are with regard to the convention team or other areas of ACPA. Let's start with Dre.
Sure. Hi, again, I'm Dre Domingue. So outside of ACPA, I'm Assistant Dean of Students and Director of Multicultural International Student Services at Hampshire College. Been involved with ACPA for going on about 12 years now. I'm currently past chair of the Commission for Social Justice Educators and the incoming coordinator-elect on the Leadership Assembly for Commissions. My other hat, third hat, is I'm alongside with Richie, I'm one of the co-chairs for our Imperative Curriculum Committee.
Excellent. Thanks so much for being here today. Bill, welcome.
Hello, Bill Huff. My pronouns are he, him, his. In my sort of outside of ACPA, I work at Georgetown University, where I'm the Associate Director in our Office of Residential Living. ACPA involvement currently is I serve on the steering team for the Houston team, ACPA 18 team. I'm also the chair for the ACPA 19 in Boston. And I am luckily one of the folks who also gets to work on the strategic imperative curriculum task force along with Dre and Richie.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Lynn, welcome.
Hi, my name is Lynn. I use she, her, hers. I'm a resident director at Miami University, and I am on the Equity and Inclusion Board for the ACPA 18 convention team.
Great. Thanks for being here. Melissa, welcome.
Hello, Buzu, Awankukwe Nadishnikaz, Nindodem. Hello, my name is Woman in the Fog, or Melissa Beard Jacob. That's my traditional name. I am Eagle Clan and a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And my day job is I work at The Ohio State University as an intercultural specialist for Native and Indigenous students. And additionally with ACPA, I am the Indigenous Advisor for ACPA 18 Houston Convention, and I'm also on the committee for the Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice and Decolonization.
Great, thanks for being here. Ray, welcome.
Thanks. Thanks everyone. Sorry about that. Dr. Ray Plaza, he, him, his. My day job is the Director for Diversity and Inclusion at Santa Clara University, and within ACPA, I have the privilege of serving as this year's ACPA 18 Convention Chair. I'm also serve as the past chair of the ACPA Latinx Network, and currently on the External Advisory Board as well. So thanks again, Heather.
Great, thanks for being here. Richie, how are you?
Good. Hopefully you can hear me. My name is Richie Stevens, and what I do most of my time is I'm serving as Acting Dean of Graduate Studies and Continuing Education. I'm also an Associate Professor and Program Coordinator of our College Student Development and Administration Program at Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I currently sit on the governing board as the Director of Professional Development, and I am co-chair with Dre, looking at the curriculum for the Strategic Imperative.
Great. So we have an incredible panel today. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground in the next hour and hopefully give everybody a chance to talk. But as we try to, on all of our episodes, if folks have follow-up comments that they'd like to make, please insert those. And for folks who are watching, if you have questions for any of the panelists about what we're talking about today or related to the convention, please tweet us at #HighEdLive. So on a previous episode, actually, I was joined by the ACPA presidential trio, Andy and Squire, the Director of Equity and Inclusion, to talk about the launch of the new bold strategic imperative. If you haven't seen that episode, we'll tweet a link to that video, which goes into a lot of background information about what we mean. But assuming not everybody has seen it, Richie, could you start with giving us kind of a brief overview as a governing board member about how the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization came to be?
Sure. So back in November of 2016, we had several days of conversation with the governing board to look at what is the direction that we want to go as an association. And so in November of 2016, we adopted this strategic imperative for racial justice. Based on conversations when we presented this information, we recognized through leadership through NAIN, the Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous Network, and other Indigenous people coming forward and saying that when we talk about racial justice, we're not inclusive. And so we had an additional education as members of the governing board to recognize that the language we were using wasn't inclusive, even when we were trying to attempt to address an important issue. And so in July of 17, based on the recommendations, we changed the strategic imperative name for racial justice to racial justice and decolonization, recognizing that those have different impacts on different individuals, recognizing there's some similarities, but there are some differences, and recognizing that we needed to be educated on both aspects as we move forward. I would say that the big piece that came forward when we introduced this was not the first imperative that ACPA has ever had. You know, we've had the student learning imperative. Learning reconsidered was really an imperative. But this one came forward because it was the first one that I think we've really had that addressed a specific issue of social justice and not social justice in general. And so I think that individuals at first hearing this felt like the ACPA was going in a different direction instead of thinking about what do we do in our work as student affairs versus thinking about how do we use this as a lens for the work that we do in student affairs. So that would be a brief overview that I think might get us started for those who are less familiar.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Richie. So Melissa, you know, this word decolonization, I think is, for many folks might be new or might be something that they're not familiar with, which is why we're going to have a deeper dive in a future episode. But can you talk with us specifically what we mean by that and how that work intersects for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the easiest way to think about decolonization is truly to think about it as it always goes back to the land. So the land that we're on, the land we're occupying, and the importance of land to Indigenous folks in our lifeways. So not only do we exist physically on spaces and pieces of land, but we also learn from the land as well. And so I always was taught that, you know, the land is a depository of culture, a depository of stories, a depository of history. So it's very important, you know, no matter where you are, to learn from the land and to find out, you know, which peoples are there, were there, you know, continue to still be there. We have to think about removal and how folks were forcibly removed from traditional homelands. And that people also continue to inhabit those spaces today. And so I think for, you know, for higher ed folks and thinking about ACPA and convention, it's just very important to think about that. You know, like in Houston, we are very much connecting with the Alabama Coshutta tribe and having the elder come and welcoming us and providing information about his culture. And so, you know, not to get too heavy into it, but I think, you know, for institutions, it's always important to just remember whose land are you on, and what are some steps that you can take to acknowledge those people and to also learn as well.
Right. Thank you. Bill, tell us a little bit about how you see decolonization intersecting with your work in student affairs.
Sure. Well, you know, I want to acknowledge first that I was one of those people that didn't know anything about decolonization. Luckily, you know, there have been really brave, mostly Indigenous folks who've been, you know, kind enough to sort of educate me. And I want to give a shout out to Melissa and her colleague Symphony, who did a presentation at last year's July leadership meeting when we were preparing for Houston that really opened my perspectives about what decolonization is and taught me how much more I have to learn and unlearn about this process. So for me, as a white cisgender male, right? So there's lots of privilege wrapped up in there. The more I've done work around decolonization, it's sort of understanding how closely colonization, when I look at it, is really tied closely to all those systems of power, specifically white supremacy. So, when I look about how our country operates, and I look at some of sort of the cultural norms that we have, this, need, this like hunger for power, this idea of like patriarchy and about, top-down decisions, that all, while really deeply rooted in white supremacy, also has a deep tie to this idea of colonizing. And so for me, how it connects is sort of really doing some deep personal reflections around, how we make decisions, who gets to make decisions. And that can be really overwhelming. I think in my work, the key is to sort of start from my center. Where do I have control? So, in my work with students, in my work on committees and task force within ACPA, when it comes to decision making, do we always do top down, or are we sort of more autocratic and flat decisions making? So really thinking about sort of simple processes and how we can make small changes. So that's really sort of how, in my own journey, as I'm sort of learning how I've been colonized, and my thinking and my ways of being, is to sort of center those small chances where I can sort of make a shift to sort of not supporting those systems that might be limiting other people's voices.
Thanks so much, Bill. So when I think a little bit about this topic and your point that for those of us who have privileged identities, we haven't had to think about, like that is a place where we can sit this one out. And so I think the point of today's episode and the point of the work around the strategic imperative is that it is our work. It is all of our work in this profession. And I often use the model from the Exploring Leadership text, the know, be, and do model. So, what do we need to know about all of the issues that are affecting higher education, but specifically about racial justice and decolonization? And then who do we need to be? Like, what are our personal values that kind of drive that? And then functionally and in terms of action, what do we do? And so I love to kind of think about tangible ways of moving from places of knowledge and philosophical foundations towards strategies for action, since we are a praxis-based profession. Lynn, do you want to start us off by talking a little bit about that, and then I'll pop it over to Ray too. So.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think for me, a good place to start is our strategic imperative syllabus that we have on the convention website. There's a lot of great self-reflecting articles and movies and podcasts for self-education and self-reflection. I think that really gets to the know part of what's happening. And then moving on to the be and do, I think it's a lot of the self-reflection and figuring out what that all means to you now, and then making a plan to carry out what you think you need to do, where your place is in the conversation.
Great. Ray, give us a little bit of context related to your position, not only on your campus, but also related to the convention.
Sure. And I think before, Heather, I just want to sort of acknowledge for the audience out there that in many ways, we are continuing the journey of this conversation. We're not the first ones that have started this. We've basically have relied on those that have fought, have raised these issues. So I want to acknowledge the heavy lifting and work from those that came before us, that were advocating, talking about these issues within our communities, our institutions before today. I think our climate today on our campuses and nationally, we're at a point where I think some of these issues are now bubbling up in different ways. So I think that's important to consider for our audience out there, that we acknowledge the lifting of others that have brought us to today. I see a lot of parallels with the discussions that we're having on our home campuses in terms of, how are we centering the voices of the most marginalized, those that have been impacted, how we look at our own systems as we think about institutional racism, oppression, et cetera. When it comes to convention, just as Richie shared about how this came about in November of 16, that was around the same time that the planning process was just starting for ACPA 18. So I think it was very important for the team that we understand what the imperative was about and how we align the convention with this broader ACPA initiative. I think if we would have planned the convention without the tie-in, then we'd be doing a disservice. So I think the convention steering team, the convention planning team was very deliberate in really heeding the guidance that was coming from the association, from Donna Lee, and then Stephen, and then the governing board, and really thinking critically about what does this imperative mean for our work in shaping what this convention experience would be and will be about as we get ready for Houston. And I know later on we'll talk a little bit more specifics, but I want those listening to sort of understand that I think that's been on the forefront of our planning process. How do we align and basically enhance and build upon the work in order to move this forward?
Thanks so much, Ray. So I know, Dre, in our kind of preparatory conversation, we talked about functional areas in ACPA. Both of us have experience leading commissions within ACPA, which for those who are new to the association, we have different types of entity groups within, but commissions primarily focus on functional areas within our profession. Talk a little bit about how that group has grappled with the strategic imperative and what kind of work they have done to come along to think a little bit about how this intersects with all different functional areas.
Sure. So yeah, I've been with the commissions for quite some time, both as a chair and now coming in as soon to be the coordinator of all the commissions. And I think our effort actually started indirectly before the imperative was announced. So thinking about summer 2016, right before the governing board actually met at our July leadership meeting, we were collectively struck by all that was going on in our country with, racial-based violence on our campus, what have you. And we literally had to stop our conversation to have a dialogue as a group. And that by itself was a pivotal moment for us forming as a group, but then planted the seed for us with the imperative. Once the imperative was announced, I think that, commissions collectively and more the leadership were really challenged with how to do this. I think there were some folks that I think in general, what I will say about the chair team is that I think collectively they were all on board. They had the values and believed that racial justice was important. But I think what I observed was that there was a how do we do this? How do we convince our director body that this is important? How do we incorporate this in our work every day? We don't have examples. And then we had the other end of the spectrum where people were ready to go doing webinars, really actively writing things, what have you. And so I think, my role in particular with that is, a little bit indirect, but, alongside with our current coordinator, Amy, is to really support those leaders, right? I keep sitting on what Stephen Quay often says is to do something, right? And I think that what gets people very challenged is they feel like I must have this perfect plan. I must, it can't, no mistakes. I'm fearful of making the mistake and what happens. And I think what I've been encouraging the folks that I work with in particular is do something, have the conversation, find ways, find examples, and we don't have to be perfect right now, but we need to start somewhere. So it's been really good. And I've been really pleased to see all that the commissions have done. I don't think this would have happened several years ago when I first became a chair. So I think it's been really small doses, but some good doses.
Great, thanks so much. So Bill, tell us a little bit about you. You also have experience with entity groups in the coalition land. Can you talk a little bit about conversations that are happening and also kind of more broadly about accountability and other things that we're actually doing, the tangible examples?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a past chair of what used to be the Coalition for LGBT Awareness and is now the Coalition for Gender Identities and Sexualities. So, I think when the strategic imperative came out, it was my last year's chair. And for us, I think as a group that has always centered LGBTQ issues is sort of seeing the intersections of our identities, right? So how do we as queer folks look at sort of the racial implications, right? The privileges I get as a white gay man. What am I doing to perpetuate trauma and harm within my own queer community? And so I think we had lots of conversations. We centered that when we looked at program proposals. Those are the sorts of, we wanted to sort of center race and decolonization in our program proposals, which is, I think, what a lot of other entity groups are doing with all the sponsored programs. For me, I think, when we talk about conversations, what I think is really difficult, because the world doesn't want us to do it, is for folks to talk about what race means, especially white people. I've been really privileged in my life to sort of be put in spaces where I've been able to sort of be in community with white folks talking about racial justice, right, and decolonization. So just, you know, shout out to the Social Justice Training Institute, which is a race immersive 5-day institute. That sort of like laid the foundation for me. And I think where I've sort of continued that is in the past year, sort of thinking about with the strategic imperative, how do we create space where we can talk about racial justice, but that we also create space for race-alike work, which we'll talk a little bit about the caucuses and how that's showing up at ACPA 18, but also across race, right? That both types of work are important. You know, for me personally, you know, engaging white supremacist culture in sort of higher ed / student affairs / the world has become a real passion for mine, passion for me. And so, you know, just a personal plug is that I have a 3-hour institute on Monday at the convention, sort of engaging white supremacy and how we dismantle it within ourselves and within our institutions. So I think what's really important is for, and I guess this is a personal call to action for my white colleagues, is that the world sort of doesn't want us to think we need to be here, but we need to be here more than anyone else. We need to sort of be in community with other white folks, hold one another accountable, do some deep personal reflection. So I think what I've really appreciated about the organization of ACPA is just creating space, because white supremacy doesn't want us to do that. And so, you know, it's small steps and having patience with ourselves in those steps. But for me, that's where I see the powerful work sort of starting to lay for us as we sort of really engage a strategic imperative.
Great, thanks so much. Melissa, tell us a little bit about another tangible action, either through the coalition work that you all have done in the network.
Yeah, definitely. I think that NAIN, the Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous Network, has done a really amazing job of trying to bring some of these like hands-on actions that folks can take back to their institutions. I mean, this has only been my 3rd year of ACPA, and it's just incredible as a Native person to walk in. You know, I'll never forget at Montreal, walking into opening session and seeing those elders on that stage, giving a blessing and a welcome. I mean, I teared up. It was just such an amazing moment for me. And so I think that even those simple things like incorporating the elders into opening session is really wonderful. Land acknowledgement, and that is something that you can do at your own institution. I know here at Ohio State, I have been encouraging my coworkers in the Multicultural Center to do a land acknowledgement before their presentations. And so it's just a simple, you know, utilize that land acknowledgement statement, honoring those, you know, that existed and still exist on the land today. And then also, you know, just looking and reaching out to your local community. And so knowing which elders and which Native community members exist here, you know, here at Ohio State, we have a community center. And so we not only have our academic Native community, but we also have our community communal center where we bring in folks to come and teach students, you know, traditional crafts and different things like that. So there's definitely lots of resources just outside within your own community as well.
Thanks so much. So not to leave off all of the entity groups, we have one other that is a place-based kind of organization, which is our state chapters. Richie, can you talk a little bit about what you know of state chapters involvement and how they're taking this strategic imperative to the regional level and to the state level? Oh.
Sure. I had the privilege of speaking at the Maryland College Personnel Association this fall. They asked me to speak on the strategic imperative. And what I found was that the members who were there were eager to embrace it and really wanted some tools. And it wasn't meaning that the individual institutions weren't already doing things, but they were eager to think through how they could do better, how they could do more. I also had the opportunity to speak at a regional conference for ACRA, which is the registrars and college admissions officers, not necessarily a great membership of ACPA, but are doing great work on our campuses. And it spoke to this and presented the strategic imperative to them. Again, very eager to want to continue to work and develop departments and divisions that were had a greater awareness of racial and decolonization issues that they may not have been part of. So I think people are ready to do the work, are doing good work, and are looking towards ACPA and others to build on the work that they're doing. In addition, we had a symposium. Some people maybe were able to attend. That was a joint symposium, presidential symposium between ASHE and ACPA. And the members of those panels and presentations did a wonderful job talking about how this strategic imperative was playing out in ASHE under the previous president, currently with our president here at ACPA, Stephen, and coming to the next presidential ASHE work that she's doing and thinking about the intersections that go along with the strategic imperative. Was a very informative information that was not only on site in California, but I think 160 other institutions had representation during the live webinar. So again, people doing great work and giving us good information to move forward.
Yeah, the partnership with ASHE, I think, has been really important as we build a base of scholars. And Lori Patton Davis's theme for the convention for ASHE next year is envisioning a woke academy. So I think there will be even more opportunities for partnership down the road as well. So Dre, why don't you and Richie tell us a little bit about the curriculum piece and what are some of the ways that curriculum play in to this conversation about racial justice and decolonization?
Sure. So Stephen Quay asked us to kind of co-chair the initiative. And so I think my perception of what had been happening is that there have been a lot of conversations, a lot of announcing, a lot of educating about why the imperative, but we hadn't gotten to the how we were going to do it. And so, again, the convention team for 2018 has done a fantastic job with creating a syllabus and identifying opportunities at convention, but being mindful that not everybody gets to go to convention, and also being mindful that if we want this to be a sustainable long-term effort, we had to create resources, tools, and opportunities to engage members and campuses beyond that. So Richie and I have been working together for the past few months, had a few calls, and I think so far where we are is that we're identifying two major goals with our group. So I think one side of the group is thinking about ACPA as an association, our leadership structure, our processes, and how do we create this as an embedded practice for racial justice and decolonization throughout. So how are we looking at award selection? How are we looking at leadership? How are we looking at statements and what have you? And then the other kind of side of our group is looking at how do we provide spaces of dialogue, kind of small self-study or kind of campus study groups, and other different kind of efforts to really engage with the syllabus that was the foundation in a deeper way. So they're actually making personal change, but also changing their campus. I'm not sure if Richie wants to add any additional things that I missed.
No, I think the only thing I would add is that we're trying to create a library of resources that the curriculum has started so that individuals can do the individual work as well as the group work that needs to happen. And so we want to make sure that we continue to have the best literature research that's going on available to our members so that they can choose to figure out how they're going to pace their own learning throughout this process and be continuous.
So you mentioned individual as well as group work, and I think one of the ways that we're going to be doing that at convention is through caucuses. Lynn, can you talk a little bit about what initiated that idea, what the form is of caucuses, what does that mean, and then how we're formalizing that within ongoing conversations about the strategic imperative?
Sure. So I was brought into the conversation after Dean, our Equity and Inclusion Board Chair, met with Stephen Quay and talked about this is what we're doing, and I was kind of handed the project. So we looked at what kind of groups we wanted to caucus around, and we were going to talk about racial topics, and so we went that way. And so we have I can't remember the final number. I think it's like 8 or 10 racial groups for caucusing. And Dean and I are coming up with guided questions. We're looking at potentially having facilitators or moderators in those groups so that the groups are small. You get some consistency if that's what you're looking for, but also an opportunity for you, if you identify as multiracial, to be able to attend multiple different caucuses, or there will be a multiracial caucus group as well. And so looking at all those logistics. And then again, I want to reference the syllabus just because a lot of the things that Dean and I have put on there, hopefully people will get a chance to look at before convention if they are able to attend. But if not, I think that, again, a lot of those resources are great for doing that self-reflection if you're unable to attend.
Excellent. Ray, other thoughts on caucuses?
I think one of the things that we've also done, and I want to thank Lynn and Dean, is really center the caucus sessions each day. So there's no conflicting thing happening. So our hope is that individuals on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday will spend that hour in their caucus groups, not worried about, do I make another meeting or do I do a program instead of caucusing? Those are the only things. So we've been very intentional with trying to provide that opportunity throughout the course of those 3 days with the hard work that Dean and Lynn and the rest of the ENI team has done. So I think that centering, I think, will be very important and a powerful message so that all of us are engaged, not focused on meetings, but engaged in this work each of those days.
Excellent. So speakers are also centering this topic. Robyn D'angelo is one of my favorite authors related to work around whiteness. Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about her as a speaker and what we can kind of expect from her contributions?
Sure. I'll echo your, so, you know, in my work around sort of engaging whiteness and white supremacy in ourselves and in our campuses, I think, you know, Dr. D'angelo is one of the leading voices in sort of getting white folks to sort of do deep personal reflective work. You know, and I think if, you know, just to point out what everyone keeps saying, that there's this reality that there's work we need to do within ourselves and then work we need to do in community. And I think the foundational pieces that she'll provide for us, you know, whether that's around, you know, the term around white fragility and how white folks tend to get emotional or angry or just shut down the conversation when we get uncomfortable, giving us some real tools to sort of build that, especially because for a lot of white folks, maybe this will be the first time they've ever engaged race. And so, you know, there was a real understanding as a convention steering team that that we need practice and we need resources when we're in convention to sort of do good work. So that we try not to cause as little amount of harm as possible. Because I think sometimes when we do this racial justice and decolonization work, we have really good intentions, and then through our good intentions, we cause a negative impact. And so I think one of the things with speakers is we tried to look at breadth and depth to try to speak to as many elements of sort of racial justice and decolonization work as possible.
Great. Melissa, tell us a little bit about additional speakers that you're aware of.
Yes, absolutely. I'm super excited this year because we have two Native and Indigenous speakers. We have Tanaya Winder and Dr. Adrienne Keene, and they'll both be speaking at the AM plenary on Monday at convention. And I'm just super excited to have such visibility of Native folks within higher education speaking. And additionally, I think that they'll also be able to provide some really great tangible tools and actions for folks to take home to their campuses. I know specifically Dr. Keene's work is with Native students in higher ed. And although she identifies, you know, she's a Cherokee scholar, very much into the study of Native students, her background is solely in higher education. So she's super excited to just get in and talk about these things, but also be able to connect folks with resources that are, you know, looking for ideas or encouragement on how to work with Native students. Because I think often, you know, folks like me in my role where I'm an Indigenous person working with Indigenous students, but we also have to think about the folks that might not be Indigenous and are working with Native students, and what can they do to try to make those connections and those relationships with students and foster that on their own campuses.
Awesome, thanks. Ray, other speakers that you'd like to mention?
Sure. So in addition to the opening and the Monday AM on Tuesday afternoon, two speakers, Melissa Fleming, really will focus on the efforts with immigrants in light of some of the national dialogue. And then Asian scholar Jeff Chang, based out of Stanford, and his work. So that'll be an opportunity to really engage the Asian community, knowing that in Houston, that's one of the larger underrepresented populations. And then we close on Wednesday with three, in many ways, activists that will sort of center how we can do this work and how that work is intersectional. The work of Jonathan Higgins, the work of Cristina Jimenez, leading United We Dream and the current efforts around our dreamers, to the work of Z. Nicolazzo and how we begin to address creating more trans-friendly spaces on our college campuses. How do we break those systems of oppression within higher ed, et cetera? So our hope is those three closers will give us some tangible tools for us to go back and be activists around these issues that are intersectional to racial justice and decolonization.
Excellent. So other core aspects that we want to mention, kind of as we close up our time today, Melissa, I know you had one other piece that you wanted to talk about regarding our elder in residence. I know you mentioned it already. Other things you want to talk about related to that?
Yeah, absolutely. We will be inviting the second chief of the Alabama Cochetta tribe as our elder this year. Herb Johnson Sr. and his son will also be there. Herb actually was able to connect with us at JLM over the summer, so it was very exciting to be able to meet him prior to convention. And so it's nice I'll be able to secondly greet him again at convention in March. But he will be with us for opening and closing, providing some welcome and blessings. And I think we're just extremely lucky to have him with us. He's battled a couple of some health complications this year, so it's super exciting that he'll still be able to join us. And I also think it really just goes back to in thinking about decolonization and decolonizing convention. You know, the ability to have this elder with us for us to learn from, a community member to take home pieces of his story. And so we're really thankful that he is going to be with us to share those gifts.
Excellent. I know educational sessions are an important part for folks to participate and attend, as well as serve as presenters. Ray, talk a little bit about how the program team this year thought about educational sessions at convention.
Sure. I want to give a shout out to Dean and the members of the program team for their efforts. We have really 400 educational sessions, and over the last few years, we know that social justice-based programs have been the most submitted sessions that we have. So I think we see that thread, that interest. One of the things that Dean's team has done is to ensure that we center not only the social justice racial piece, but also ensure that we are covering decolonization and not making the assumption that we all know what that means. So working with Melissa, members of NAIN, and others, really being intentional throughout the course of the different 14 program blocks to make sure that we have these different opportunities. And among those 400 different sessions, we have 14 different program types. So I think there's lots of different opportunities for our attendees to learn in short impact statements, 20-minute sessions, 3-hour sessions, like Bill mentioned, to research poster or research paper presentation. So I think we've tried to be very diligent to weave that through, in addition to all the other 9 competency areas, in addition to social justice, as well as some of the functional areas as well.
Excellent. I know you and I both share having been program chair, and it is a massive undertaking. And so I applaud your group in that work. Richie or Dre, if one who's watching today wants to be involved in the curriculum committee, are there some times at convention that they might connect with you all? Dre, you want to say?
Sure. Yes, there are actually 2 times. Richie had the wonderful suggestion of, we've been doing a lot of conversations virtually, so we wanted to have some FaceTime. And so if you happen to be attending convention, we have 2 time blocks, Monday, March 12th, from about 12:15 to 1:15 p.m. is the first one. And the second one is Tuesday, March 13th at 8:45. Locations will be publicly in the program materials. Just talk to Ray about that. So thank you, Ray. If for some reason you can't make those times, or in general you want to be connected to the committee, feel free to reach out to me personally or to Richie. We'll be happy to catch you up for sure.
Excellent. And I know at the start of the episode, we tweeted out everybody's Twitter handles. So folks want to connect with you that way, that's one way to do it. I'm sure there's also places online where we can find your contact information as well. So Bill, you mentioned at the beginning that you are chairing the 2019 convention in Boston. Plans I know are already underway. This is not a short endeavor, planning a convention. Talk a little bit about how you're kind of creating some through lines between this convention and what's going to happen in Boston.
Sure. Well, it's a privilege to be in a leadership position on the 18 team and to have seen the intentional work that's been done to be able to continue that work through the 19 team. So we just met the steering team, which is a core group of about 11 folks. I met in Boston last week for our initial site visit. One of the things that we've done in our planning, because we've been meeting for the past 6 weeks, is really sort of centering the idea of decolonization. And because we'll be in Boston, which is part of the original colonies, there is like a deep-rooted colonization shows up in a lot in that city and in how we think of that city. And so for us, as we've been creating logos and as we think of pictures that we use, not causing trauma to people, which images, there are things that are tied to colonization that I would have never, the role of lighthouses as colonizing symbols. It's one of those things, as we were looking at logos, even simple symbols can cause pain. And so we've been really purposeful. It means our process is deep and complicated, and that we suggest something and then we have to create space and community for dialogue. And so as we move forward, I want to welcome, we move in with the best of intentions, but we will make mistakes at times. And so just keep centering and making sure we include as many voices as possible, but sort of trying to stay humble in the work that we do and knowing that the work we do sort of needs to reflect the greater diversity and inclusion of ACPA's membership. So that's sort of where we're at. We will sort of be like sponges in Houston, and so you will see us with we sort of wear buttons. And so if you see someone with an ACPA 19 button, and there'll be plenty for you all to have as well, to reach out to one of us. If you have ideas that you want to do, send our way, feel free. You can always sort of tweet out at the Greater ACPA handle and they'll pass it along to us. So I'm really just sort of excited to sort of see all the great new things that the 18 team has planned, and then just build upon the awesome foundations they've laid for us.
Yeah, ACPA is slightly famous for the button, the name badge flare is one of my favorite parts. And although it kind of hurts your neck after a little while, you have to be careful about not weighing it down. So I know the deadline for registration is approaching. Ray, what are the things that you would tell folks about registering for convention and then other ways to engage?
Sure. Before I get to that, Heather, I do want to acknowledge that we know that going to Houston, Texas, has been a challenge for some of our members. We think about our individuals in California at state schools who, because of state travel bans due to Texas politics, can't attend with state funds. So we know that's impacting. We also know that due to safety considerations, we know that they're members of different communities, whether it be trans, others, or those that are undocumented or immigrants, don't feel safe in Houston. And I think that's been part of our work in this racial justice piece, is to be advocates. And we started that process from the very beginning and advocating against some of the laws that didn't pass in Texas, but sort of set that climate. So we're mindful of that. So as I think about the deadline, this Friday, February 9th, is our next major registration deadline before rates increase. So we're trying to promote, get the word out. We're also sensitive that, budgets are tight all around. So I think we're mindful of that. For those that are not able to join us in person in Houston, we're making available some virtual ticket options. And more information is going to be coming about that. So if you're not able to join us in Houston, there's going to be some opportunities to see some live sessions that are streamed, all of our speakers, certain sessions on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday as well. We believe that we have a lot to offer. I know that we talked about the Ed sessions, Heather, but we'll have a special Wednesday edition of Higher Ed Live, sponsored by you and Tony. We'll have the 20th anniversary of Cabaret. We have a Career Central that's going to be really focused on career advancement and development. We'll have our marketplace of vendors. We're reshifting how we do PKs, lots of engagement opportunities. But one of the other pieces too is some service learning opportunities with the Commission on Student Involvement. We know that Houston was impacted by Harvey, and in many ways is still being impacted. So we're working on some hurricane recovery efforts through the Commission on Student Involvement and some other ways for those that are maybe can attend, that they can also give back to the community in some different ways. As well as we have a common read, which I know will be, that link will be tweeted out in terms of March Book 3, the third in that trilogy that's really authored by Representative John Lewis. And it sort of mirrors sort of this dynamic about racial justice and why that's important. So we have a lot to offer, and our hope is that whether it's that undergrad participating in Next Gen to that mid-level, senior level faculty member, this is an opportunity for you to be a part of ACPA 18.
Wonderful. I can't wait. I can't wait every year for ACPA, but this year especially, it's gonna be fabulous. So final thoughts, one thing each of you would like to leave our viewers today with regarding the work about understanding racial justice and decolonization in advance of convention, and then a resource that you'd like to share, or something related to the topic that we can pass along to help folks continue their own development and understanding a knowledge base. Dre, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think my final comment is inspired by a couple of emails I've gotten recently. And I think, you know, even hearing the conversation today, there's a way in which there's a readiness that I think all of us collectively have to do the work. And I just want to have an open invite to people that no matter where you are in this process, you are welcome. There's a place for you to do the work with us, and that you won't be doing it alone. So for resource, I go to my old standby, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, 3rd edition is awesome. And there's a really great unit that really unpacks racial justice and decolonization, so I highly recommend checking that out.
Great, thanks so much. On my shelf, I love that book. Bill.
Sure. I think one of the things I've learned from one of my mentors, Kathy O'Bear, is this idea of having patience with yourself and with others. A lot of people go to hostility, they go to anger, they go to impatience, but this is a journey. So I would say when however you show up, if you could show up in Houston, or if you show up digitally, is to show up to these spaces with care and compassion, because people show up in the spaces and the places they are, and that we can sort of move each other ahead from that place. And sort of resources, the one that I find really helpful in sort of engaging white supremacy, there's an article by Kenneth Jones and Tema Akun called White Supremacy Culture from Dismantling Racism, a Workbook for Social Change Groups. If you Google that, it's an amazing article that I actually threw across the room once because it just was too real. And I always find the things that I'm the most resistant to are probably the most impactful in my life, and that's been a tool that I use a lot in my work.
Excellent, thanks. Lynn, what are your final thoughts?
Great. I think to echo a little bit of what Dre and Bill just talked about, but also showing up and being vulnerable to having those conversations and engaging in them. I think really that self-reflection and being vulnerable will help a lot. I think for me, there's a lot of resources out there, but I think connecting with that vulnerability piece, I think Brene Brown has some really great books. Daring Greatly has really impacted me in my work and my career. So I think that's a great book to read.
100% agree. And Rising Strong, I think, also talks a lot about kind of showing up for opportunities of collective action and what that means as individuals and then as a part of a larger group. So showing up at ACPA. Melissa, your final thoughts.
Yeah, You know, I think that for folks that are still kind of like wondering why add the decolonization piece to the strategic imperative? And I think one important thing to remember is that, you know, Native folks are not only racial identities, but we also come from a very political place. Actually, one of my colleagues in Maine, Dr. Denise Hennings, I'll never forget when she said, I don't go a day without thinking about the federal government, because the federal government classifies our identity, our blood quantum, our tribal communities, you know, federal recognition. I have to carry a card that says I am this much Native American. And so I think it's really important for folks to understand that, you know, as a Native person, I don't only come to a space as, you know, ethnically or racially Native, but also very much a political being. And I think that's one unique thing about Native identities that folks often don't really understand or maybe have never been exposed to. And that's something I'll talk a little bit more about in one of the programs that I am presenting at convention on decolonization. And so we can delve a little bit more into that. But I think that's just a little snippet of, because I know some folks are like, well, why do we need to add decolonization? Doesn't racial justice completely encompass Native folks as well? And it really doesn't. Which actually leads into one of my resources would be an essay by Eve Tuck called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. Fantastic article. I've used this in my own research, and I think she really gets to the heart of the fact that essentially decolonization is not a metaphor. There's not a synonym, and kind of goes deeper into why racial justice does not completely encompass Native folks. And then also A Third University is Possible by La Paperson, who is actually a pseudonym for K. Wayne Tuck, or Yang, excuse me, on the Tuck piece as well. And this talks a little bit more about decolonizing institutions and what it means to be on Indigenous lands.
Excellent. Great resources. Thank you for sharing that. Ray, your final thoughts.
I think for me, as we do some of this work on our campuses, is for each of us to understand what are our salient identities, what do we bring to the table? And oftentimes, some of there are things that folks don't see. They make assumptions about that, and I think that's very important for us. I echo what everyone else shared. How are we vulnerable? How do we self-reflect? And how are we prepared to learn and acknowledge and move forward? So I appreciate. I think we're excited about what 18 has to offer for us. You know, we don't have a theme, but our catchphrase is being bold. So my hope is, are you prepared to be bold with us this March in Houston?
Excellent. Richie, final thoughts?
Sure. You know, I get the privilege of teaching some of our newest professionals each year in the intro course. And the two things that I teach them when they come into the classroom is that, first, you're an educator. And remember that, because education doesn't happen just in the classroom, it happens outside the classroom. The other is that you're a lifelong learner, that every year, every semester I go into the classroom, I expect to learn as much from the students as they take from me. And in most cases, I learn more. And so really trying to set that tone. And one of the books that I was going to mention was Brene Brown's Daring Greatly. She had a great impact on me when she spoke at ACPA several years ago. But I pushed the students out to say, how are you going to be vulnerable? How are you going to change who you are? How are you going to think about things differently? And we use that for the lens of every topic that we talk about. And I specifically bring that back into the social justice course that I teach, as well as the capstone, because they have to do pachakachas. So, but that whole idea of saying, how do you continue to push yourself professionally? And it fits right into how we need to challenge ourselves around the strategic imperative and the privilege that most of us bring to the experiences of being in higher education. The other book that I will just put out that I have just become aware of from the ASHE Symposium is Racism Without Racists. I don't know why I wasn't aware of this. I've just started looking at it. It is a great text, and I do encourage people to think through this, because it's a pretty good text thinking about white privilege. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. You mentioned learning, and I think we are all responsible for our own learning and for participating, not just in the classroom as we, seek our graduate degrees, but then following up with professional development. So I know I learn every year when I go to convention, and I look forward to engaging with you all and engaging around these topics. So thank you so much for sharing about the upcoming convention today and about racial justice and decolonization in the strategic imperative. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, I am working on putting together a panel to dive deeper into the topic of decolonization in higher education and in student affairs. So stay tuned for that announcement about the coming episode. Also in March, you can catch Tony and I at both NASPA and ACPA moderating fast-paced debates about contested issues in student affairs. You will receive my reminders about these and other episodes by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter, and you can also browse our archives at higheredlive.com. Again, I'm Heather Shea. Thanks again to our fabulous panelists and to everyone who's watching, and to Erica for tweeting the back channel. Make it a great week, everyone. Thanks.